and welcome to another episode of Frick 5. I have the honor in this episode of interviewing Xavier Salomon, tireless, fearless Peter J. Sharp, Chief Curator of the Frick Collection. Hello, Xavier.
Hi, Amy.
Nice to see you. We hear a lot from you in the enormous amounts of programming that you are producing in this period, but we don't get to hear a lot about you. So I think a lot of people are interested in hearing about you. And we've actually had a lot of people write in asking if you would be an interviewee for Frick 5. So I hope we are satisfying a lot of people. So let's jump into the first question. What is the work of art or museum that changed your life?
So, many people probably don't know that to begin with, I wanted to be an archaeologist. And I still wonder at times why I'm not an archaeologist. And I think, if I think back, one of my earliest memories at all in my life was when I was about 5 or 6 years old. And I was at a friend's house with this friend and her mother. And I remember seeing an image of Tutankhamen's mask. And I don't remember if it was in a book, in a magazine, on TV. I don't remember. But I just remember this image just hitting me and thinking that I'd never seen anything so beautiful or interesting or fascinating. And soon after that, I became so obsessed with this. And I remember my parents bought me a paperback edition of Howard Carter's book on the discovery of the tomb I still remember, in a Swiss supermarket. And I still have a copy of this book. Yeah, I don't know why they were selling Howard Carter in a Swiss supermarket in Lugano. But anyway, they did. So, and I pored over this book and I wanted to be Howard Carter. I mean, who wouldn't want to discover something like this? And I think those images of the inside of the tomb of Tutankhamen, those black and white images still haunt me to this day. And the idea that you're opening the space that has been untouched for 3,000 years and everything is left there by the hands of these Egyptian people who just left it there. I mean, it's miraculous. It's amazing. And the interesting thing for me also is that I've actually, even though I still love these objects so much, I still have never seen them. I've never been to Egypt. And even though I wanted to be an Egyptologist, I'd never gone to Egypt, partly by choice, because I worry about being disappointed by this. So this for me is still a very mythical series of objects really from the tomb, that remain for me as images in my head rather than as real things. And I think that also they go hand in hand with my all-time hero and role model. And I think, I started watching Indiana Jones movies when I was a kid. And I was thinking about this recently, actually. And I still think a lot of what I like about art history is Indiana Jones related. So the idea of discovery, putting things in context. I also hate snakes. I wish I was as handsome and wonderful as Indiana Jones, but I'm not going around digging tombs. But at the same time, I feel maybe in the future. But I feel like archival discoveries, looking at works of art, to me, it's some of that sort of wonderfulness of Indiana Jones is still somewhere in there, and I still aspire one day maybe to be a bit like him.
So yes, there is one place in the world that Xavier Salomon has not visited.
It's Egypt.
But you will get there. You will get there. Okay, so obviously these are objects that you haven't seen in person, but what then, for the next question, is the work of art in the world that you would want to live with every day?
So here I'm slightly cheating, because instead of living with a work of art, I've chosen to live in a work of art. And as everyone knows, I've worked for a long time on Paolo Veronese. He's my favorite artist. I was thinking very hard about which Paolo Veronese would I want at home. And of course, I would love to have one of the Frick paintings. I mean, they don't quite fit in my New York apartment. But and then I thought, if I really need to have a Veronese, I want to have the best. And for me, the best is Villa Barbaro at Maser. I mean, this is a Palladio building in the middle of the most beautiful sort of Veneto countryside, with wonderful views from every window, a beautiful garden with an infeum and sculptures, and entirely frescoed by Veronese. So every room is this great sort of architectural combination of sort of figures and plants and statues. And so I feel like I wouldn't be tired living in a house like that. And the idea of having a house that is a work of art, to me, is particularly interesting. So combining Veronese with Palladio and being close to Venice, to me, sounds like my idea of heaven. And I think I would be quite happy living there.
So I wonder if you've given any thought to how you might furnish a home like this.
I think very Spartan, actually. And that's the way it is now. The people who live there, the owners of the villa, have very little furniture. And I like that. I mean, there are bedrooms with very nice beds. And I imagine, going to sleep every night and waking up and looking up at the ceiling and seeing this, or, one of these frescoes. It's pretty fantastic. So that's something to aspire to.
Absolutely.
Sure.
And that's what's important about this, of course, it's architecture and painting in a site, a geographic location. It's sort of like the triple triple check of all the things that you could possibly want with your enormous library of books, of course, moving in.
That would be difficult to put. I don't know where I would put the shelves.
Okay. Next question is, what is the book and piece of music that inspire you the most? So let's start with the book.
So the book is Memoirs of Hadrian by Marguerite Yourcenar. And this is linked to my childhood in Rome. And again, when I was at school, I went to primary school with Franciscan nuns. And I have to say, they were very good because they used to bring us as kids to lots of sites and things to see in Rome and outside of Rome. And I remember a particularly wonderful day visit to Hadrian's villa at Tivoli. And that left a lasting impression. And growing up in a city that was surrounded by ruins, the Pantheon, I used to go to the Pantheon the whole time. And so when I first read this book, I think I was a teenager, it really struck a chord with me. And, it's a fictional autobiography of Hadrian. Marcus Aurelius, his successor, wrote his own meditations. And so Yourcenar based this idea of an emperor writing about himself at the end of his life. It starts with him as an old man in Tivoli, recounting how his body is failing. And it's a book about everything. It's a book about power and failure. It's a book about love, about sickness, health, youth and old age, family. And I find myself reading it over and over again. It's not a very big book. It's a fairly short novel. It's only like 6 chapters. And I think I read it at least once a year. And every time I read it is as if I'm reading it for the first time again. And I keep noticing things that I haven't noticed before. So for me, it's this constant book that I keep going back to. And again, between Indiana Jones and Hadrian, I'm sure they're sort of different role models, but, and, I don't want to make Hadrian as, the greatest man who ever lived, but I think, his interest in culture, the arts, philosophy, his sort of, curious family life between sort of having a wife and being a homosexual and how that sort of worked. I find all these things very, very interesting. And the fact that this is also a book about a homosexual man written by a homosexual woman, I find quite interesting. And Yourcenar has such a sort of interesting voice as an author. The other thing I love is that the book was translated into English. I mean, in French, it's really wonderful, but in English was translated by Yourcenar's partner, who's called Grace Frick. And she has nothing to do with the Frick family, as far as I know. But there is another sort of strange link there. And so the Grace Frick translation is still the English translation. That's really wonderful to read.
Well, and I think as a historian, as art historian, and somebody who's so interested in history, being able to read a figure that is so, polarizing, et cetera, for his complexities, right? I think is a really important thing that you're not treating these were bad people, these were good people, but you get a fuller picture of them as individuals. Absolutely.
And I think also the scholarship behind researching this life, it's a fictional book, but it is very well researched. And the facts of Hadrian's life, as we know them, are very well portrayed by Marguerite Yourcenar. She did an incredible job with that. So I'm usually slightly skeptical of historical fiction, but this is actually one of the really great books in that genre.
With a great cover.
A great cover, great sculpture. I mean, that would be another nice thing to have at home, a bust of Hadrian. That wouldn't be bad. And now music instead.
Yes, music.
Something quite different. And, I'm a great opera lover. So for me, it's Verdi. And I couldn't really choose a specific opera. I mean, my favorite Verdi opera keeps changing throughout my life. So it used to be for a long time Ballo in Maschera, and then of course it was Traviata for a very long time. Now I really love Macbeth. I think Macbeth is an incredible opera.
That has to do with your Shakespeare book club, I think.
That's partly to do with Shakespeare too, but it predates the Shakespeare book club. But sort of Trovatore and Rigoletto, they're all amazing. But I think it's a combination of Verdi and Maria Callas. So Maria Callas has made me fall in love with opera, and she has also destroyed opera for me, because I can never listen to a Verdi opera without thinking of Callas's voice. So as the many wonderful artists I've seen on stage at Covent Garden, at the Met Opera, many of whom I love their performances, but somehow Callas always remains in the shadow and kind of wrecks every one of those performances. So when I was a kid, my father had a big collection of LPs of opera. That's how old I am. And I used to listen to them when I was a kid. And most of them were with Callas. And there is something about her voice that is so imperfect, slightly nasal, so kind of dramatic. It's not a perfect voice. And yet it's so emotional. And I listen to Callas's voice almost every day of my life. I listen to something, and every time it sends shivers down my spine. And it's not just Verdi, also Puccini, Bellini, think of Casta Diva. But I mean, recently, I think, the Lady Macbeth madness scene from Macbeth, from Verdi, it's something that it's just an extraordinary piece of music. And with her interpretation, it's just unbelievable.
And that's important, that it's not perfect, that it's individual, but not perfect, right?
Yeah. And I think the thing, I always think if I could go back in time, the one thing I would love to do is go back and witness a performance by Callas, because everyone always talks about what a great actress she was as well. And that there is only one film of the second act of Tosca. That's the only thing ever filmed of Callas performing, which is sort of amazing when you think about it. So it's lost. I mean, people, my grandmother used to tell me when I was a kid about seeing Callas on stage and how, the mesmerizing effect of being able to see that. And that's something we can't do today. But her voice, it's haunting. And so I think that is the music that, to me, since I was a kid, I go back to over and over and over again.
And rediscover, right? As you re-listen and have different favorites. Yeah. Okay, we're going to move into different territory. There's a negative aspect to this question and a positive. Let's start with the positive. Let's start with the negative. Who would you say is the most overrated artist?
So for me, it's Caravaggio. And
hate you for this. People are going to hate you for this.
I know. I think Caravaggio is terrible. I'm sorry, people. I've worked on 17th century Italy for a long time. And I think, he's a good painter. He's an interesting painter for a number of reasons. I'm not saying he's a bad painter, but there are many better painters than him. Think Velázquez, think Rembrandt. Just in the 17th century, there are many painters who are much, much better than Caravaggio. What I really hate is the industry, especially by art historians around this. There are, 15, 20 catalog resumes of Caravaggio. There are books, articles coming out the whole time. I have something like 3 shelves in my library of books just dedicated to Caravaggio, and I've stopped buying them because they're just too many. I've given up. And the exhibitions, every year there's something about Caravaggio. And even if it's not about Caravaggio, Caravaggio's name has to be put in it. Right. Then there is the whole thing, we found a new painting. They keep finding new paintings by Caravaggio every month. And they're, one worse than the other. And, then they find his bones, and they find his, it's just become this really ridiculous thing. And then, the discussion of Caravaggio as a modern artist who fits with our sensibility today, which there's nothing further from the truth from that. I mean, Caravaggio is a 17th century artist. He's like very much about the concerns of that time. He's looking at antiquity. He's looking at religious issues. He's looking at all sorts of things that have nothing to do with this modern hero we've constructed in the 20th and 21st century. So that's why, I used to love looking at his paintings growing up in Rome and going to see it. And now I just can't bear it. And I think it's changed over time as well. When I was a kid, many of the churches in Rome with Caravaggios, there would be people looking at them, but not the crowds you have now. I mean, try and go to San Luigi dei Francesi these days, and there's always a massive crowd in front of the Contarelli Chapel. And I think it's overrated. I mean, that's simply what it is. He's a great artist, but there are many better ones.
The industry of Caravaggio has sort of ruined the artist himself.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because for me, he was an artist that when I was a teenager, I loved him. I thought he was absolutely wonderful. And, to some degree, I still do, but it just really wrecked it over time. And I started working on this period in art history, and I'm just not interested in it anymore. I just can't deal with it. It's just too much, and it's not that interesting.
Conversely, who might you throw some attention on as the underrated artist?
So I'm going to move to sculpture. And when people talk about Italian sculpture, they always talk about Michelangelo and Bernini, and then later Canova as the great Italian sculptors. And I think that's true. I mean, they're all great artists. But the one that to me never gets the appreciation he really deserves is Donatello. And even though he is one of the 4 Ninja Turtles, he's seen, compared to Raphael, Leonardo, and Michelangelo, people don't talk that much about Donatello. And he is one of the greatest, if not the greatest, Italian sculptor. And I think, you couldn't have Michelangelo without Donatello. You couldn't have Bernini without Donatello. And I've chosen this, the St. George, just because I love it so much. It's such a simple sculpture. But the idea that in the early 15th century, someone is looking at antiquity in this interesting new way, bringing it back with this elegance and simplicity that other contemporary artists didn't have, and how important that is. And so, I don't know why people don't think of Donatello that much. There hasn't been a Donatello exhibition in a really long time. There hasn't been a book on Donatello in a really long time. And he seems to be someone who's somewhat out of fashion. And so I hope that, I think he's underrated. He should be considered more and discussed more, and put in the canon of Western European art in the place he deserves, I think.
And in this image, it's not just sort of the freestanding figure on top. The relief on the bottom too, is so important for not even the history of reliefs, let's say pictorial imaging in the 15th century.
And, his relationship with painting, obviously that is true of Michelangelo and then of Bernini as well. They all had a very close relationship with painting. Canova too, even though I think it's better if we forget about Canova's paintings, but that's another discussion. But I think, Donatello, we don't know of him as a painter, but these reliefs are almost like paintings. The idea of this sort of very thinly carved relief and this sort of pictorial solutions. He's just an extraordinary artist.
I agree. Okay. So then final question, and my favorite question, which is, if you could have your portrait made by any artist, who would that be?
So I would have chosen Sargent, but then you stole Sargent away from me. So no, I'm joking. I actually would go down a very strange choice because and it's a good question. I would love, of course, Veronese to do my portrait, or, or Titian or Sargent, or lots of great portrait painters. Who wouldn't want a portrait by Velázquez? But I've actually in recent times fallen in love with this very interesting Polish artist from the early 20th century, who's called Jacek Malczewski. He was active at the end of the 19th, early 20th century. He dies in the 1920s. And he made these portraits of Polish aristocrats and military figures and intellectuals. They're all more or less the same format. They're life-size, but they're horizontal. And they always have these extraordinary backgrounds with lots of seriously weird stuff happening. These are painted around the time of First World War, so often you have the trenches, but then you have, there is a naked woman climbing out of a ladder from a hole in the ground, and these weird cliffs with people climbing. I have no idea what these things actually represent, and I don't even know if he knew what he was representing. But there's always this aspect of setting up these beautiful portraits, again, beautifully painted, really haunting, against these very odd background. Sometimes you have winged horses in the back, you have Pegasus, you have, all sorts of things. And I've been traveling to Poland a lot, and I love looking at his paintings in the museums there. He's a painter who's not really represented in American collection, as far as I know, at all. I would love to see more of his portraits. I think most of his portraits were given by his son to the museum in Warsaw. So most of his holdings are in Warsaw and in other museums in Poland. Many of the descendants of the sitters still own these portraits. So many of these are in private collections in Poland. And you see them often in exhibitions in Poland. He's a very, very famous, very celebrated artist. But I think there was a show on him at the Musée d'Orsay many years ago, a couple of decades ago. And that's been it. So I also dream of buying a Malczewski at some point, but I don't know if I could ever get a Malczewski out of Poland. But it's, not for the frick, I think more for my own apartment. But I thought, I would love to see it for him. And also I would love to see what he comes up with as a background for my portrait. So that's...
For sure. Because, two things. One, do you know that this portrait kind of reminds me of your brother?
He does look a bit like my brother, it's true.
And the second thing, is there any idea of how the backgrounds came to be? Like, was it something worked out with the sitter? Was it something that was completely brought by the artist himself?
I think it was mostly the artist. There are cases where I'm sure the sitter would have had some saying in it. So there is a famous portrait of a collector with some of his objects in the background. But, sometimes there's musical scenes, people making music in the background. They're all meant to be allegorical. things. And often they're also about the sort of freedom of Poland. Poland didn't exist in the late 19th and early 20th century. So even though these people were living in Poland, it's about the kind of independence of Poland. And finally, the country exists again after 1918. So a lot of it is about the sort of political, historical, social background of Poland in that specific time. I'm curious to think what someone like Malczewski would do with our own times and what he would put in the backgrounds as backgrounds for portraits. It would be very interesting.
Well, I see in yours sort of a fantastical version of Villa Barbaro.
Probably, yeah.
Something like that, yes. Well, thank you very much, Xavier, for doing Trick 5 with me, and I'm sure all of our viewers appreciate it as well. We will see you soon.
This has been a lot of fun. Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.